Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Globe's Black History Month Film Festival, a celebration of the lives, culture, and creativity of Black Americans throughout the world of film. I'm Megan Irons, and I'm an investigative reporter at the Boston Globe, and I'm delighted to be here. I'm delighted that you're joining us for what I hope will be a fantastic conversation about our history here in Massachusetts and the role African Americans played in their own liberation. And I've got the best people joining me this afternoon to have this conversation, three amazing women, two scholars and a filmmaker who will help us through this journey. Today, we're going to talk about Jubilee, Juneteenth, and the 13th, a special film presentation of the African American History Museum in Boston and Nantucket. The film portrays the influential but often overlooked role that African Americans in Boston and Massachusetts played in the abolition of enslaved people in America. With me today are Dr. Kelly Carter-Jackson, Associate Professor of the Africana Studies Department at Wellesley College, Dr. Carrie Greenwich, Assistant Professor of Race, Colonialism, and Diaspora at Tufts University, and Sylvia Stevens-Edward, an award-winning television producer, Senior Community Relations Director for Corporate Philanthropy at Liberty Mutual, and Chair of the Board for the Museum of African American History. Welcome, panel. I am so happy you are all here to talk with me today and to share your insights. I want to start with the opening of this film. It's December 31st, 1862, New Year's Eve, and the eve of the Emancipation Proclamation. The nation was approaching its third year of a bloody civil war. President Lincoln, declared the next day that all persons held as slaves within the rebellious states are and henceforth shall be free. Carrie, I want to start with you. Set the mood for us. Paint us a picture of what was happening in the church pews, in the Boston Music Hall, in the living rooms, in the Black community, and the significance of that moment and what it took to get there.
Well, so we know that in 1862, it's the eve of the signing of the Emancipation Proclamation, and African Americans met in Boston at the Meeting House, at the Music Hall, all over the city to celebrate this momentous occasion. We know that there were many members of the Black community who had been involved in emancipation since the beginning. So we have William Cooper Nell, born and raised in Boston, lived right across the street from the African Meeting House. His house is still standing. We have people like Lewis Hayden, a formerly enslaved man from Kentucky, a leader of the Black community. His house on Phillip Street was a safe haven for fugitive slaves in the Black community. And we know that the mood was one of jubilation because despite the fact that the Black community recognized that the Emancipation Proclamation did not immediately end slavery, it did signal the end of over 400 years of enslavement on American soil, on what became American soil. And so this was a joyous time when January 1st came. There's newspaper reports of people hugging and kissing in the streets. There's stories of them cheering on. There's stories of them gathering around the Boston Common to cheer the fact that this momentous occasion had happened. So it was a moment of triumph in terms of the Black community, not because slavery existed in Massachusetts, but because it signaled a new day for African descended people across the United States.
Let me unmute. Sylvia, I thought it was really powerful to lead off the film this way with these two pivotal moments, the one in the music hall and the one at the Tremont Temple. And at the Tremont Temple, it was this very diverse group. Frederick Douglass was there. He would write in his autobiography later, "We were waiting and listening for a bolt from the sky, which would render the fetters of 4 million slaves." Talk to us about why you chose to lead off the film that way? And what was your thinking in how you wanted viewers to experience that moment?
Well, there were it was dramatic. Okay, so that's number one. And the other piece is you want to meet your audience where they are. Okay, and everybody has the story of the Emancipation Proclamation. Everybody has the story of Lincoln freeing the slaves. So that's where you want to start. But you also want to start with the joy, as Carrie said, the joy of people feeling we can be free. Okay, my other relatives, my other people can be free. And that was monumental. I mean, it started out with watch meetings that Black churches have now, really came from that day of watching and waiting for slavery to end. So there, I grew up in the South, and there we had watch meetings, and you thought it was about New Year's, and but it turns out the origin was actually about the Emancipation Proclamation. So you want to start where an audience knows. You want to get them involved emotionally as quickly as possible, so that they would go with you, and therefore it's somewhat of it's a motif of being a flashback. Here's the monumental event. Now let me tell you how we got there, and that was the point of doing it. And the 13th part of it was helping people to understand that indeed and in fact, slavery was not abolished until the 13th Amendment, which was in 1866. So it was a dramatic way to engage your audience very, very quickly, and then help them do the flashback to say, how do we get there?
Kelly, why does this history matter? There was so much in this film that we didn't know, so many people that were new to us. Talk to us about why this history matter, and do you think that we need in Massachusetts need to have a reckoning with our own role in the history of slavery in this country?
Oh, this history matters so much. It matters so deeply. And that's because I don't think, as a historian, I don't think we can understand the present without understanding the past. I don't think we can think about where we go in the future if we know where we've already been. And so for me, I think it is compelling to be able to live in a space in which, this history is so close to us. It's so you can walk through it. You can go through the museum and you can, experience what it's like to walk in the same space that Frederick Douglass was in or Lewis Hayden was in. And you can think about what was it that they thought was impossible and yet sought to accomplish, and how much more can we, as equipped with technology and all kinds of, how much more can we do as a people now? So I think it matters a great deal. And I think not just in Massachusetts, but all over the country. But I'll say because we live here, I think we have a responsibility to know this history, to own this history, even its ugly parts, even its flaws, and to use that as a way to inform how we might make decisions or make policy or think about where we might go in the future.
And so, Carrie, do we need to have our own reckoning with our role in this history?
I think we need to have everywhere in the country needs to have a reckoning with enslavement, also with just the way that the country itself is structured and built, and that is by design and has a history behind it and isn't just something that is a natural occurrence. I think one of the things about Boston is that we do have these two competing stories of ourselves, right? On one hand, we're a place where you have abolition, you have some of the earliest movements for desegregated schools, and yet it's a place where you have busing in the 70s and you have segregated education up to this day. So I think in a place like Boston and Massachusetts, it's reckoning with the complications implications of our history, and saying, reckoning with all of it. So enslavement technically ends by about 1790 in the state of Massachusetts, and yet Massachusetts is involved in, many of its industries are involved in the production of slave-produced cotton into textiles. And so I think we need to reckon with our past, but I think the way we reckon with our past might look different than the way somebody in, say, South Carolina reckons with their past, or somebody in Oklahoma reckons with their past. And it's all a reckoning, right? And it's in order to really take place on a national scale, understanding kind of the specifics and the nuances of what the history is.
What about you, Sylvia? What's your thoughts on this?
Well, again, I always say I'm a Southerner. I would say I'm not a native of New England. I am straight out of slavery, and I was fascinated that we all of what we didn't know. Okay, and the fact that the reckoning. The film American history we talk about is complex. It's not black and white. It's like we live in the shades of gray, and the realities, you can't talk about American history unless you talk about slavery. It's just not possible. But also to come to it with a sense of learning, a sense of understanding, so that you can move toward empathy. And if you can move toward empathy, then you can understand what the future could hold. I mean, one of the things I also say is that when you understand that the 14th Amendment allowed everyone in this country who came after 1868, their citizenship is based on what happened out of slavery. So when you see this disconnect of, you end up with this, you know, the artificiality of race overlaying everything, when you realize that in many ways, the work of African-American people to acquire equality is the work that is moving us toward a more perfect union, but it also opened up everything for everybody else. It opened up for women to vote, women's right. It opened up for disabilities. It opened up for gay rights. So when the process of I guess repudiating, if you want to say that, slavery is the process of creating a country that can be multicultural and embracing of all different cultures. And so it's a positive perspective on one way. Someone asked me, said, it left feeling very positive. But on the other hand, I thank God I did it a year ago, right? Because it doesn't feel that way anymore. It feels like we're back into 1850s again. And so that's the scary part.
That's fascinating. Bridget, I want to show our viewers a short clip from the film, just to give you a sense of it. In a minute, you'll see it.
I'm walking down the northern slope of Beacon Hill, in the neighborhood that blacks in Boston's 18th and 19th century called home. Today, this is one of the most exclusive and expensive areas in the country. Hello, I'm Hill Harper, and I'm on a journey to explore this Boston hidden history.
Join Hill Harper as he explores America's journey from slavery to freedom. The story that begins with the settlement of the English in North America and the hidden heroes, people of African descent.
Is this literally what we're looking at, what it looked like back then? Or is this kind of a cooler, more modern version? Like, is this literally where he walked? These are the exact floors where Frederick Douglass actually walked?
These are the same floors.
The exact same floors?
Yes, the exact same floors, the exact same halls, the exact same sounds that you're hearing, the windows, all of these things. This is the oldest extant black church building still standing in the United States. So it's built in 1806. This is really, you're really walking in history. There's been renovation on the building, of course, but in terms of the floorboards, in terms of the pulpit, in terms of the pews that you see and the acoustics in here, this is what was here when African American people were here in the 19th century.
Thank you, Bridget. What was fascinating to me about this film, and it's something you said, Sylvia, was a lot we didn't know. One of them, and a lot that sort of, poked holes into what we've learned about history thus far, right? We found out through this film that Black people were pushing for their liberation. They were, long before white people thought, okay, let's get in on it. They were pushing the powers that be in government, in the legislature, to do the right thing and to point out the contradictions of what the laws say versus what the realities they were living. Carrie, I want you to talk about that and talk about that sort of advocacy that we don't know very much about, that was so prominent in this film, and what that says, and how that sheds new light into our understanding of our, ancestors' role in reshaping of our country.
Yeah, I think that we tend to believe the story that somehow enslaved people were freed because somebody got a conscience and decided to free them, right? And really what we know is that slavery, as historians have shown, Kelly has shown in her book, right? If slavery is really this act of violence, and constant battle, then of course Black people are constantly fighting back. It might look different in Jamaica in 1650 than it looked, in Florida or in Massachusetts, but it occurred. And so I think that's the main takeaway. In terms of Massachusetts and Boston, the idea that white Yankees in New England suddenly came to become anti-slavery because they were different than white people, say, in South Carolina, is not really true. The Black community is the one that's pushing them, going all the way back to 1701, when you have an enslaved man who's responding to Judge Sewell in the state of Massachusetts. It goes all the way back to the 1650s, when you have the first African-American woman purchasing property. So that's an act of the Black community constantly being what the laws and the structures of the society deny that they are. And that is what ultimately leads to emancipation and to freedom. Massachusetts would not have had personal liberty laws if it were not for the Black community on the North Slope of Beacon Hill protesting in the 1840s at the African Meeting House, right? And in the buildings that we see in the museum. So it really asks us to reorient the way that we look at freedom and the way we look at the long trajectory, and who is really on the side of that trajectory towards freedom. It challenges what we've been told is the way that freedom is attained in this country.
Kelly, Lewis Hayden, William Cooper Nell, David
my boyfriend,
Elizabeth Mumbet Freeman. Why don't we know their names? And should we all be doing a better job in ensuring that our kids are learning this stuff?
Yeah, I think there's a couple reasons we don't know their names. One, I think that a big part of the way history was told was really very ego-soothing for white people, white historians, white liberals, who wanted to be able to see themselves as the heroes, right? Like of the abolitionist movement. And so we don't get Black voices, or Black voices got pushed to the margins and to the peripheries of their own, contributions. So there's that. I also think it's the fact that, Frederick Douglass, I love him, but he dominates the 19th century in a way that sort of silences other Black leaders' contributions. And I've talked about this a lot in my work, how we tend to only focus on like one great Black man and one great Black woman per century. And in the 19th century, it's Frederick Douglass and it's Harriet Tubman. But there's so many other men and women like Lewis Hayden, like his wife, Harriet, like Mariah Stewart, like David Walker, or William Cooper Nell, that contribute so much to the world that we benefit from today. And I I think the third reason is that someone like Lewis Hayden is pushing the boundaries. You know, he's violating the law. He's committing illegal acts and he's killing people. Now we look at that as somewhat justifiable given the stakes, but at the same time, I think that there is a real timidity about presenting people that don't necessarily use traditional channels to bring about change. But I tell my students all the time, well, if you're not considered a citizen, if you don't have the ability to vote, how else can you advocate for yourself? How else can you push to make change? And so in a lot of ways, Black leaders had to force their own freedom in order to get people to change the law.
Mhm.
I would say too, from a broader perspective, I always say it's his story. It is about his story, which is he who writes the story tells the tale, which is our former Attorney General said it's all about who gets to write the history. And I think that's really true. And I'm a little older than everybody here, but when I was in school, there was no African-American studies or African-American history. And so, and when I came to, I grew up in the South and I knew that, that America was a myth. The whole tale was a myth. By my lived experience, I knew that because I was in the segregated South. And integrated to schools and understood what that process would be. But my point is, until there was African-American studies, okay, you had Benjamin Quarles, you had W.E.B. Du Bois, okay, you
John
had
Hope Franklin.
John Hope Franklin, right? You only had a few historians that were really looking at what was there. I'll never forget the Peculiar Institution. It was like, wow, you know, all that slow moving and I don't know nothing actually was a way of subversion. You know, if you knew stuff, they'd make you work harder. If you did it quicker, there was no reward for being industrious, okay? And as you look at American history, there's that other part of it is that if it's not in there, the people who write the story, as Kelly just said, they get to tell it from their point of view. But the documents were there. That's an interesting thing. And here in New England, there are a lot more documents than there are in the South because they burned them all, or, you know, they didn't write it down. So when you have the opportunity and then there's a wherewithal to do that, and there's a need for it, and there's a support for it, then you get those stories that haven't been told. You get that hidden history. And that's what we've seen over the last 50 years, bringing us to Kelly and Carrie as being PhD and Ds in history and being able to be valued for that. One of the things the museum does is it also offers the Museum African American Stone Book Awards, which is celebrating the academic work that historians and scholars are doing to really make these stories come alive and so that people can actually see them. And so you have to think about who's writing the story. What fascinated me about history was I was a little kid and you see the big palaces and they'd have the clean white floors on the movies, right? And then when you got to really study European history, no, they had all the cows and the chickens and the dogs and everybody in there with them. And it was not quite that clean place. So what I'm saying is the images are what was written and the stories that are told. And that's what now having African-American scholars come forward, they bring that history to light.
Yes, you're right. We have in the past half century been benefiting from the works of the historians on our panel and others bring us to light. Like to this year, I mean, people were just getting used to learning about Juneteenth for the first time. People were learning about Tulsa for the very first time. So there's a lot of work still left to be done, Carrie, in sort of bringing a lot more of the history and better incorporating it into American history, because people want to make this like a separate history, but Black history is US history. Can you talk about that? And Kelly, can you follow when she's done?
Yes, I would say that I think that we're in a moment where people are searching for answers as to why we are in the place that we are. And so this is often a good way that people come into studying and really questioning what they've been told about history for their lives. I think that we need to recognize that people often come at history from different ways. So I encourage people to read books, right? If you don't like to actually sit in front of a book, listen on the your iPad, listen in your car, listen to podcasts, as Kelly said before. Sort of absorb this history. It's out there. It's written about. It's not as if it's missing. It's that we are now in a moment where we can get access to it and read it and engage with it. I do think that one of the promising things about this moment is that people are responding to stories that even 4 or 5 years ago would have been questioned their veracity. So I'm thinking of Tulsa. I'm thinking of all these moments that we talk about. And so I think that in and of itself is nothing else comes from this moment. It's the moment that we have access to information and so many ways to engage with that information than just people who don't like to read. Go and find a podcast or to listen to something that describes the history.
Yeah, I would say that, we're in an interesting moment in which there's like constant polarization. So there are people who really want this history, who are seeking it out, who are reading, who are listening, who are watching, who are going to the museum, who are trying to get as much of this as they possibly can. And on the other side of that, you have people that are actively trying to keep this out of the school, trying to keep this out of the classroom and out of, when you think of all of the critical race theory fanatics, it shows you just how high the stakes are when we think about history, that it's not just dates and names and places, but it's causes, it's consequences, it's citizenship. How do we understand our own citizenship? You can't understand that without looking at the contributions of Black people. And so, for me, it's really empowering to have this history and to have Black women writing it, Annette Gordon-Reed included, like the transformative work that she has done with just, Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings. Like, these are the different perspectives that we need, but we have to also keep in mind that when we go to do that work, that we are always going to be up against some sort of backlash. And I think that, this moment that we're in shows that people are constantly trying to resist truth.
And I'll just
before you start, Sylvia, I just want to encourage our viewers to ask questions of our panelists. We have a Q&A feature here. If you have any questions about the film, which we need to address. Where is the film showing? Where can people watch it? Can you tell us real quick where that's going to be, Sylvia?
There are screenings at the museum. For this year, this film is sort of for members only. And this is our way of getting you to engage and become a part of the museum and help us to do other films and help us to keep the museum moving forward. So we encourage people to join the museum because you will have opportunities to screen it. We also look for organizations who would like to join as a company or as a nonprofit. We have different rates for membership, but we are showing it. This was a public arena. There are other arenas. There's going to be a showing at the museum next week with the Museum of Science. So there you will be able to see it, but you must engage with the museum.
Okay. Bridget, can you show another clipping, the second one for our viewers? And we'll talk on the other side.
This is what was here when African American people were here in the 19th century.
The first abolitionists, whose centuries-long fight for freedom and equality intensified during the antebellum and Civil War years in Boston, and accelerated with the Emancipation Proclamation and 13th Amendment. Harper meets acclaimed historians who fill in missing pages of the American narrative Dr. Carrie Greenidge, author of Boston Abolitionists.
Some people have had this mistaken idea that abolitionists were white people who were out to rescue and save enslaved African Americans. And really, abolition comes from enslaved people themselves who free themselves. It comes from Black people who lived in places like Boston.
Dr. Kelly Carter Jackson, author of Force and Freedom, Black Abolitionists and the Politics of Violence.
One of the favorite stories I love telling about Lewis Hayden is the kegs of gunpowder that he allegedly kept in his home, so that when slave catchers, approached his doorway looking for fugitive slaves, the idea was you can leave in peace or you can leave in pieces. And I think, and he meant when he said no one was willing to call his bluff, but it just shows how committed he was to using force and even deadly force and violence to make sure that Black people found their freedom.
And Dr. Annette Gordon Reed, author of On Juneteenth.
The end of chattel slavery was important, and the end of it with the efforts of Black soldiers too. I mean, that's the other thing about it, that the Union Army, the United States Army, was able to be successful with the infusion of Blacks who were fighting for their rights. So to have this day come after the defeat, the total surrender of the Confederate Army, I think it's a good way to commemorate that.
Thank you so much. We have some questions from our audience, and I would like to get to them. One of them is, I'm familiar with Juneteenth and the 13th, but what is Jubilee? When and where is it celebrated? Sylvia, you want to take that?
I'll take that, and then I'm going to pass it over to Carrie. Jubilee is celebrated by the Museum of African American History on what we call First Night every year. And the Hayden and Hayden Society and the museum does a program every year celebrating the Jubilee. Jubilee was the way that African American people in Boston from revolutionary times would celebrate any movement toward freedom, toward equality. Okay, Jubilee, and they called it Jubilee because that's joyousness. Okay, and that was for the people who fought in the Revolutionary War that you didn't know about unless William Cooper Nell wrote that book that showed you who they were. Okay, he's the first African American historian. They celebrated it. There was a big thing when a Jubilee for the Blacks. Sailors who participated in the War of 1812. So that's what Boston called celebrating a freedom, or celebrating the movement toward citizenship or being a part of this country. Carrie can expound upon that a bit more.
Carrie?
Yeah, I think the idea here is that, with all the embrace of Juneteenth, we tend to as much as we're expanding our knowledge, we're also, not accounting for the fact that in a place like Boston, in which slavery ended by the end of the 18th century, you had generations of people who celebrated all types of emancipation. For instance, there's always been a large Haitian American community in Greater Boston. And since, 1810, Black people in the city of Boston celebrated Haitian independence, right? You have Black people celebrating in Boston West Indian Emancipation Day that happened in 1833. And so the term Jubilee is really to account for the fact that you have Juneteenth, which originated in Texas and spread throughout the African diaspora, but that was part of this notion of celebration, right? So that Black people, it's not just that Black people in Texas celebrated Juneteenth, it's just Black people in Massachusetts and New England and other places that we don't really talk about or think about, celebrated various ways that emancipation came to themselves and their communities.
Ellie, I wonder if you could answer this other question. It says, in terms of CRT, how would you recommend that educators implement this in higher education?
I mean, it's complicated. So critical race theory is actually not something that is taught in K through 12. It's not really taught in undergraduate classes either. It's something that was originated in law schools, and it was taught in law schools to understand how race and the law intersected and the ways that race and racism had a negative impact on people's lives when it came to the law. So it's not something we use critical race theory or CRT as a catch-all, right? As just throw in DEI, throw in diversity, equity, inclusion, throw in anything Black, throw in anything multicultural, and then put an X on it. Right? That is just not that's just not the case. So I think the way that you incorporate it in your classroom, and I'm not going to say just critical race theory, but the way you incorporate Black history into your classroom is just teach it, right? Like
teach American history.
It is American history. It is absolutely American history. It's not like some little subset off in the corner. You really can't understand American history without understanding Black contributions. You can't. And so I always tell people to layer their learning, to read as much as they possibly can, to listen when reading is a little difficult, to go to the actual places to get sort of that like tactile experience. And then to not just take that information and sit on it, but to act on it. James Baldwin has this great quote where he says, it's important that we be student activists, that we act on the knowledge that we have. So don't just get the knowledge for the sake of feeling good about yourself, but think about how that knowledge can impact how you vote, where you shop, what you buy, where you put your kids in school, where you purchase your home. Like all of those things have a tremendous impact on the way that we live our lives.
Sylvia.
And I would just add to that. I think that we, in this moment, we've gotten, obsessed with this moment of critical race theory, as Kelly has said, and that really is not something that's taught in any undergraduate or elementary school setting. But if you want to engage with the issues that are talked about in the film, go to the museum, go and visit and stand outside and look at the building. As Kelly's saying, engage with the environment and read, books, and any event that you think in American history in which Black people were not there, your check should be they were there, right? Even if the story you were told was that they were not, chances are 9 times out of 10, in some ways that's connected to Black people or the African diaspora. And so if we change that way that we're looking, then it actually doesn't become about, we have to go search for stories that don't exist. You're actually engaging with the story that is there, but that people haven't been telling.
It's the fuller story. But I'm going to say this added on top of that. This is another pet peeve of mine, is that anything that African Americans do, any gifts, contributions, they become American. They take off the African American and it becomes American. Jazz, American music. Food, American food, which is really food that came from the South and came from slaves, okay? Hip hop, okay, it's American, okay? Clothes, all of those cultural things. If you think about the cultural norms that are there, once it's decided to be positive, it becomes American. As long as it can be denigrated, that's when they put the African American on it, okay? And so that's where, and that whole point of, the cotton gin was not necessarily invented by, I forget his name now, who said it was it was a Black guy who actually thought of that process. Even Jack Daniel's bourbon has to come out and say, actually, the formula came from a Black man. So I'm saying that that sense of whitewashing, if you will, that piece of, as Carrie just said, we're always there, okay? It's not that it's not a part of American history, but you cannot teach American history unless you deal with the implications of slavery. It's just not possible, Yeah.
Well, teaching history. I mean, that should just
that's teaching history.
Right?
Okay.
Here's another question from someone in our audience. I am learning so much about how the U.S. was built on slavery. Can you discuss reparations? How, for example, we would put a monetary value on Black lives?
That's a hard one. I'm going to let the historians.
I think the answer is yes, and it's complicated. One, can you put a value on a life? No. You know what I mean? You can't say, okay, $100,000, like that won't suffice. But can you go about trying to rectify the harm that has been done? Absolutely. So I tell, my son, like, you can't steal somebody's bike and then say, I'm sorry. You have to return the bike. You know what I mean? You have to make it right. You have to, or compensate them for the amount of the cost of the bike. And that is absolutely possible. We actually have a precedent in this country for reparations. We did it with Japanese internment camps. We have done it on a corporate level. There are ways in which we can find how to repair the harm. And the harm, I want to be clear, is not just the harm of slavery, it's the harm of Jim Crow and segregation and redlining and mass incarceration. There is a lot of restorative justice that needs to take place. The question is not, can we do it? The question is simply how and when.
We don't have a lot of time yet, but we're getting a lot of questions, which I love. Here's another one. Carrie, you might want to take this one. We hear that America needs a reckoning with the institution of slavery. How do you think this would look or come to be? Town hall meetings, truth and reconciliation type of forums? How do you see it?
I think it gets back to reparations and economics. I mean, once you start to talk about the system of slavery as a racial system, political system, and an economic system, town hall meetings are good and discussion is good, but I think actually having real money behind the fact, why is it that issues of the ways in which the Homestead Act, for instance, right after the Civil War, allowed mostly white people to go into what was native land and live on that land. And that's how you get fortunes that still exist in places like Nevada and Montana and Wyoming and the Dakotas, right? To this day, right? That's a monetary value that African-American people and Native people were not given the same or accorded the same access. And so that's a very real thing. So I definitely think we tend to like to really talk about feelings and discussion. And I think when you actually get into the monetary and the structural and really try to dismantle that, that's where you actually have some substantive change that will come. In a place like Massachusetts, it's concentrating on enslavement. It's also concentrating on the way that neighborhoods were built, as Kelly's saying, redlining, in the ways the laws that had to do very recently in the 1950s, something called B-Burg in Boston that basically tore down a neighborhood in which people of color were told they could come back and they never got to come back. And there's probably some people in Boston who are still alive and still remember that. So I think that once we start to really talk about reconciliation, as Kelly's saying, it involves all of these what Saidiya Hartman calls the afterlives of slavery, right? It involves all of these things that continue to persist as a result of the slave system under which we functioned. And it often has to do with the economic things that would be involved in actually doing some reparative justice.
And a really telling one, which studies have been done in the Lancet on healthcare, and the fact that the reason that the US does not have the safety nets for healthcare or healthcare for all really stems from that racial bias that would allow all people, because it's no longer just like, it's not like the Homestead Act, it can only be for the white people. It would allow all people to partake of it. And that's why we don't have universal health care here. So the implications are deep, and they're much more inclined with that economic piece of it than you would ever imagine.
Sylvia, just one last question. We have less than a minute. Can one join the museum and view this film online?
That is one of the things that we're working on, making sure that we will be coming up in the future. So yes, you can. We will figure there is a way to do that.
Listen, I enjoyed having all three of you here with me today to talk about this important film and talk about the role of Black history in our history. And I want to thank you all for taking the time out to share your insights. See the film if you're able. Thank you all and have a fantastic Black History Month. I'm Megan Irons. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.